It was my first time flying on a commercial plane, and I remember feeling that kind of excitement you only get the first time you do something new. Everything felt a little bigger than usual, a little more important. Even small things like boarding the plane, finding my seat, and looking out the window felt like part of an experience I had been waiting for. The trip itself was simple. I was just flying from one city in California to another to visit my girlfriend. There was nothing complicated about it, nothing that should have made the trip stressful. At least that's how it started. Somewhere during the flight, though, I started feeling off. At first, it was easy to ignore, just a slight discomfort in my stomach, the kind you brush off without thinking too much about it. I figured it was probably nerves. Flying was new to me, and I thought maybe my body just wasn't used to it yet. Or maybe it was something I ate earlier. It didn't feel serious at the time, just annoying. But as the flight went on, that feeling didn't go away. It stayed there, sitting in the background, slowly getting worse. Not enough to cause panic, but enough that I noticed it more and more. By the time we landed, it was clear that something wasn't right. I got off the plane and made my way to the hotel, thinking maybe I just needed to rest. But that's when everything really started to hit. The nausea got stronger. Then came the constant discomfort. And then it turned into something much worse. It wasn't just feeling sick anymore. It became constant trips to the bathroom, one after another, with barely any break in between. The kind of thing that drains your energy quickly, leaving you weak and unable to focus on anything else. Time started to blur together. Hours passed, then a full day, then another. It didn't get better. If anything, it stayed the same, like my body was stuck in that state, with no sign of easing up. I wasn't eating properly. I wasn't sleeping properly. Everything felt off. And after a few days, it reached a point where I couldn't just wait it out anymore. I knew I had to get checked. So I went to the hospital. The waiting room felt endless. Sitting there while feeling that bad makes time stretch, in a way that's hard to describe. You watch people come and go, listen to small conversations around you, and just wait, hoping your name gets called soon. Every minute feels longer than it should. Eventually, after what felt like hours, they finally called me in and put me in a room. And then there was more waiting. Just me and my girlfriend sitting there in silence. I didn't have the energy to talk much, and she could tell something wasn't right. She stayed close, quiet, just being there while we waited for someone to come in and tell me what was going on. After a while, the door opened. A doctor walked in. She was wearing a mask and gloves, which didn't seem unusual in a hospital setting. But there was something about her presence that felt distant. Not cold exactly, just disconnected. Like her attention wasn't really in the room. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she looked at my girlfriend. "Please leave the room," she said. It caught me off guard. I didn't understand why that was necessary. In my mind, I was just there for something like an infection or a stomach issue. Nothing serious enough to require privacy like that. So I spoke up. "No, she can stay. It's okay." The doctor didn't respond to me. She just looked at my girlfriend again and repeated herself. "I think you should leave." There was something about the way she said it that changed the feeling in the room. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't casual either. There was a kind of weight behind it that made everything feel tense all of a sudden. I looked at my girlfriend, then back at the doctor. "Can you just wait outside for a minute?" I said. She hesitated for a second, clearly unsure, but then she nodded and stepped out of the room. The door closed behind her, and the second it did, everything shifted. The doctor finally turned her attention to me. "You have HIV." She said it just like that. No build-up, no explanation, no pause. Those words landed immediately. It felt like the air had been pulled out of the room. My brain didn't process it right away. There was a moment where everything just froze. like time had stopped, and then suddenly everything rushed in at once. That's not possible. That doesn't make sense. I got tested. I know I got tested. I can't have that, I said, almost without thinking. I got tested before being with my girlfriend. I was clean. She didn't react to what I said. She didn't explain anything. She just repeated it. You have HIV. Still distant. Still not really looking at me. That's when the panic started to build. It wasn't loud. I wasn't yelling or anything like that. It was internal. Tight. My chest felt heavy. My heart started beating faster. And my thoughts began looping over themselves, trying to find some way this could be wrong. I looked down at my hands. They were sweating. Not slightly. Actually sweating. And that's when it hit me in a deeper way. Not just as words, but as something that might actually be real. In those few seconds, my mind started racing ahead, thinking about everything that would change. My life, my relationship, everything shifting into something I hadn't prepared for. I can't, I said again. I got tested. I know I did. The doctor flipped through a page, still not meeting my eyes. Then she asked for my name. I told her. And for the first time since she walked in, she looked up. Her eyes met mine, and something changed. I'm so sorry, she said. I have the wrong chart. Just like that. You have strep throat and laryngitis. The silence that followed felt just as heavy as the one before, but in a completely different way. It's hard to describe what that moment felt like. It was like my entire world had just shifted into the worst possible version of reality, and then instantly snapped back. In those few seconds, I had already started imagining everything that diagnosis meant. The consequences, the conversations I would have to have, the way my life would change. And then it was gone, replaced with something else entirely. Relief, but not the normal kind. This was overwhelming, almost disorienting. Like my body didn't know how to handle the sudden shift from panic to safety. My heart was still racing. My hands still felt tense, and my thoughts were still catching up with what had just happened. It felt like the world had ended, and then restarted in under a minute. I just sat there for a bit, trying to steady myself, trying to let everything settle. Eventually, I got up and walked out of the room. My girlfriend was still there, waiting. The moment she saw me, she tried to read my face, trying to figure out what had happened. I told her everything. From the moment the doctor walked in, to what she said, to the mistake. She listened, then gave a small, awkward laugh and said, "But you don't have AIDS, right?" I looked at her and said, "No, of course not." It was a mistake, a terrible, terrifying mistake. But even after that, something about the experience stayed with me. Not just because it was wrong, but because of how real it felt in that moment. How quickly everything can change when someone in authority says something like that without hesitation. How your mind can go from normal to worst-case scenario in seconds. And the strangest part is, even now, when I tell people this story, they ask the same question. "But you don't have AIDS, right?" And every time I say the same thing. No. A whole lot of no. But those few seconds, the ones where I thought everything had changed, they don't really fade. They stay with you. Because for that moment, it felt completely real. When she talks about it now, even after so many years have passed, there is still a strange weight that comes with the memory. It is not something she remembers like an ordinary childhood moment. It sits differently in her mind. It brings back that same uneasy feeling she had back then, like something in her world had quietly shifted before she even understood what was happening. It wasn't just fear in a single moment. It was something that stayed with her long after everything ended. She was about 11 or 12 years old at the time, old enough to understand small parts of the world, but still young enough for everything to feel simple. Life had a small shape back then. Her days were predictable. She would wake up in the morning, get ready for school, walk the same route, come back home, and repeat it again the next day. There wasn't much beyond that. Her world didn't feel big or complicated. It felt contained in a way that was both safe and limiting at the same time. She lived in a trailer park with her family. It was one of those places where life felt quiet in a very specific way. People knew each other enough to recognize faces, but not enough to really know everything about each other. There was always some distance, even between neighbors. Everyone had their own routine, their own space, their own small world inside the larger one. Most days passed without anything unusual happening. In the mornings, the neighborhood had a familiar rhythm. Kids would leave their homes and gather in small groups, walking together toward the bus stop. Adults would head off to work or stay behind, starting their day in their own ways. The sound of footsteps on the pavement, the occasional greeting between neighbors, the distant noise of cars leaving the park, all of it created a background that felt normal and steady. It was the kind of environment where nothing seemed out of place because everything followed the same pattern every day. Her bus stop was not far from her home. It was just down the street, close enough that she could walk there in a few minutes with the other kids from the neighborhood. Every morning, she would meet the same group, mostly girls her age, sometimes a few younger or older children, depending on the day. They would stand together waiting for the bus, talking about school, teachers, homework, or completely random things that made sense only to children. Sometimes they would laugh about something small. Sometimes they would just stand quietly, half awake, waiting for the day to begin. At that time, nothing about it felt unsafe. In fact, it felt like one of the most ordinary parts of her day. The bus stop was near houses, and people were usually around. Windows were open, doors would sometimes be unlocked while people moved in and out. And there was always a sense that nothing bad could really happen in a place like this. That was how it felt in her mind back then. Simple, predictable, protected by familiarity. But that feeling did not stay the same forever. At first, it began in a way that didn't feel clearly dangerous. It was more like a small discomfort that she didn't fully understand. One morning, while standing at the bus stop with the other kids, she noticed something unusual in one of the nearby trailers. There was a man standing inside near the window. He wasn't outside. He was behind the glass looking out toward the street. At first, she didn't think much of it. People look out of windows all the time. It's normal behavior. Adults often stand near windows while drinking coffee or checking outside. It didn't immediately register as something strange, but something about the way he stood there stayed in her mind for a second longer than it should have. It wasn't casual. It didn't feel like someone just passing time. He was still, too still, and focused in a way that didn't match the normal background activity of the morning. She tried to ignore it. Children often notice things, but don't always know what they mean. So she turned back to the other kids and continued talking, letting the moment pass. But even as the bus stop routine continued, a small part of her attention kept drifting back toward that window without her fully realizing it. The next morning, she saw him again. Same place, same position, standing at the window, watching. This time, she paid a little more attention. She wasn't sure why. Something about the repetition made it harder to dismiss. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It felt like he was there on purpose, waiting. And then she noticed something in his hands, a camera. At first, she wasn't completely sure. It was small enough that it almost blended into the background. But once she focused on it properly, the detail became clear. He was holding it up near the window, pointing it outward toward the street, toward the bus stop. toward them. That was the first moment a strange feeling formed in her chest. Not full fear yet, but something close to confusion mixed with discomfort. It didn't make sense to her. Why would someone be taking pictures from inside their home while children were waiting for a school bus outside? She didn't say anything at first. She just watched quietly for a moment, then looked away, hoping maybe she had misunderstood. But the memory stayed with her. And then it happened again the next morning, and the next. It became a pattern. Every day she went to the bus stop, he was there. Always in the same window. Always watching in the same direction. And more often than not, the camera would appear again. Raised, pointed, clicking in moments she could not fully see, but somehow felt were happening. The discomfort slowly grew into something heavier. It was no longer just a strange detail in her morning routine. It began to feel like something that followed her, even when she wasn't directly looking at it. The bus stop, which once felt like a normal part of her day, started to feel different, less safe, more exposed. She began to notice other small things too. How often she found herself glancing at the window without meaning to. How her conversations with the other kids became shorter. How she sometimes arrived at the bus stop with a feeling in her stomach that she couldn't explain. It was like a quiet awareness that something wasn't right, even though everything around her still looked normal. For about 2 weeks, this continued. 2 weeks might not sound like a long time, but for her, it felt stretched. Each morning carried the same uncertainty. Each afternoon, when she thought about the next day, the feeling would return. There was no clear explanation, no proof of anything wrong that she could fully describe, but the sense of being watched became harder to ignore. Eventually, she told her mother. It wasn't an easy conversation. She didn't have the right words to explain it clearly. She was still young, still trying to understand what she had been seeing. She simply described what she noticed. The man in the window, the camera, the fact that it kept happening every morning. Her mother listened carefully. She didn't dismiss her concerns. Instead, she treated it seriously. There was a change in her expression as she understood what her daughter was saying. Something about it clearly didn't feel right to her either. Not long after, her mother contacted the police and reported the situation. She explained everything as clearly as she could, hoping it would lead to some kind of investigation, or at least a check on what was happening. But nothing changed immediately. The mornings continued. The bus stop routine remained the same on the surface, but everything felt different now. The man was still there, still watching, still holding the camera at times. And for her, every minute at that bus stop felt longer than before. It became harder to focus on anything else. Even conversations with the other kids faded into the background. Her attention kept drifting toward that window, waiting for movement, expecting to see him again. That expectation itself became part of the fear. At home, she tried not to think about it, but it stayed in her mind anyway. Even simple thoughts about school mornings carried a sense of discomfort now. It was no longer just a place she passed through. It had become something she was aware of in a different way. Her mother noticed the change in her behavior. She could see that her daughter was becoming quieter in the mornings, more hesitant to leave for school. After seeing this shift and realizing that nothing had changed after the first report, she contacted the police again. This time, action followed. Officers arrived in the neighborhood. It was noticeable immediately. People came out of their homes watching from a distance. The usual calm of the trailer park shifted into something more tense. There was a feeling in the air that something serious was happening, even if not everyone knew the details. The officers went to the trailer that had been described. What they found inside confirmed everything. There was a wall covered in photographs, images of her, images of the other children who waited at the bus stop. Images taken from different angles and different days. It was not random. It was organized, intentional. clear evidence that left no room for misunderstanding. The situation changed immediately after that discovery. The man was taken into custody, handcuffed, escorted out of the trailer, and placed into a police vehicle. The same window that had once felt like a quiet background detail in her mornings was no longer part of her daily life. For her, the moment brought mixed emotions. There was relief because it was finally over, but there was also anger because it had taken so long for anything to happen. And underneath all of that, there was something deeper, a lasting awareness of how long it had gone on without anyone fully stopping it sooner. Years later, when she looks back, what stays with her most is not just the ending of the story. It is the time before it ended. The ordinary mornings, the standing at the bus stop, the feeling she couldn't fully explain at the time, but now understands more clearly. Because now she knows something she didn't know then. Sometimes fear doesn't arrive suddenly. Sometimes it is already there, slowly building in silence, long before anyone realizes it is happening. When I was about 18, I read a collection of Lovecraft stories. It wasn't the real Necronomicon people talk about online or in horror myths, just the actual fiction written by Lovecraft. At the time, I didn't think much of it beyond being a bit of atmospheric horror reading. It had that classic style where everything feels unknown, cosmic, and slightly unsettling. But once I finished it, I kind of laughed at myself. I remember thinking I had maybe overreacted while reading it. It was just fiction after all. Nothing to carry into real life. That feeling stayed with me for a while in a light way, like a memory of being slightly spooked, for no real reason. I went back to my normal routine. Studies, friends, daily life. Everything felt normal again, and the book became just another thing I had read and moved past. The next year, I went on holiday to Crete with my dad. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing trip. Warm weather, clear blue water, a break from everything. Nothing unusual or dramatic. We had talked about it for weeks before going, and I was actually looking forward to it because I had never been somewhere with water that looked so open and endless. On the first day, we went straight to the ocean. The water looked incredibly clear, almost unreal in how blue it was. The sun was bright, reflecting off the surface in a way that made everything shimmer. There were other people around, but not too close. It felt peaceful, like the kind of place where nothing could really go wrong. I remember not hesitating much. I walked straight into the water and started swimming out deeper with my dad nearby. It felt refreshing at first. I mean, the cool water against the heat of the sun, the sound of waves becoming softer the farther I went. It was one of those moments where you feel completely detached from everything else. We kept going a bit farther out, just enjoying the space. My dad was swimming not too far away, and I remember feeling oddly calm, just floating and moving through the water without much thought. Everything felt open and quiet. Then something strange happened. At first, it was very subtle. I felt a light sensation around my legs, like a soft brushing or tickling under the surface of the water. My first thought was that it might be seaweed or some kind of fish passing by. The ocean is full of things like that, and it didn't immediately feel alarming. But when I looked down, I couldn't see anything clearly at first. The water was deep enough that visibility shifted depending on the angle and light. Still, the sensation didn't go away. It felt like something was moving near me, not aggressively, but in a way that made me uneasy. I remember pausing and taking a breath, trying to focus. I told myself it was probably just my imagination reacting to unfamiliar surroundings. But the feeling didn't match that explanation. It felt too present, too physical to ignore. I decided to dive under the water to get a better look. The moment I went under, everything changed in how I experienced it. The light above me became distorted by the surface, and everything turned quieter, more muted. In that moment of confusion and sensory overload, my mind interpreted what I was seeing in a way that didn't match reality. The shapes around me seemed to shift and move in a chaotic pattern. My brain tried to make sense of it instantly, and instead of clear images, everything felt exaggerated and overwhelming. What I thought I saw in that moment felt like rapid movement around me, shapes and forms that I could not properly identify. My mind, already under stress from surprise and fear, filled in the gaps in a way that intensified the panic. It felt like I was surrounded by things I couldn't understand, and my body reacted before I had time to think. I came back up almost instantly, gasping for air. That's when the panic fully hit me. My breathing became irregular, and I struggled to stay afloat for a moment. The fear wasn't logical or structured. It was raw and overwhelming. I remember trying to orient myself, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't, but everything felt like it was happening too fast. I started breathing in water by accident as I struggled to calm myself. My body was reacting purely on instinct at that point. My mind was overwhelmed, and I couldn't properly regulate my breathing. The ocean, which had felt calm just moments earlier, now felt like something I needed to escape from immediately. I remember seeing movement around me again when I went under briefly or turned my head in panic. My mind was interpreting shadows, light patterns, and underwater motion in a distorted way due to the panic state I was in. Everything felt exaggerated and unfamiliar. It was like my brain was misreading every visual signal and turning it into something threatening. I kept struggling until my dad reached me. He swam over quickly and pulled me toward the shore. I remember clinging to him, still trying to breathe properly, still disoriented. It took a while before I could fully calm down. My chest felt tight, and my thoughts were scattered. I could tell he didn't fully understand what had just happened in my head, but he focused on getting me safely back to the beach. When we finally made it to shore, I sat down and tried to steady myself. My breathing slowly returned to normal, but I still felt shaken in a way I couldn't explain properly. My dad looked concerned, but also confused. He told me later that he hadn't seen anything unusual in the water. From his perspective, everything had looked completely normal. He had just noticed me suddenly panic and struggle. But for me, it had felt completely different in the moment. At the time, I didn't understand what had happened. I tried to make sense of it afterward by replaying it in my mind. I remember trying to connect it to things I had read before, especially the Lovecraft stories from the year before. Those fictional images of unknown creatures and deep ocean fear somehow resurfaced in my thoughts afterward, making the experience feel even more confusing in hindsight. For a while, I didn't have any real explanation for what had happened. It felt like something had gone wrong in my perception, but I didn't have the language to understand it properly yet. After returning from the trip, life continued, but the experience stayed in the back of my mind. Not as a clear memory of something external happening, but as a confusing moment where I lost control of my own perception and panic took over. Later on, things in my life started to shift in ways I didn't fully understand at first. There were moments where my thoughts felt unstable, where my emotions would swing more intensely than expected, and where I struggled to separate strong internal experiences from external reality. At the time, I didn't have clarity on what it meant. I just knew something felt different in how I was experiencing things. Eventually, I went through proper medical evaluation. That process was not simple or quick. It involved conversations with doctors, assessments over time, and discussions about patterns in my thoughts, emotions, and past experiences. It wasn't about one single moment or one single event. It was about understanding a broader pattern that had likely been developing for a while. That was when I was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. Hearing that for the first time was not easy. It reframed a lot of things in my life. Some memories that once felt confusing started to make more sense in a clinical way. It helped explain why certain experiences felt the way they did, including moments where my perception or interpretation of reality had become unreliable under stress or emotional strain. There was also a difficult emotional part of that realization. I started reevaluating past experiences, relationships, and decisions. There were times I questioned what was clearly real, what was influenced by my condition, and what had been misinterpreted during difficult periods. It wasn't a simple process. It took time to accept that some of the things I had believed or felt strongly about at different points in my life didn't always reflect objective reality. That realization affected how I saw my personal history. It changed how I understood certain interactions, emotions, and reactions I had in the past. It also created a period of adjustment where I had to rebuild a sense of stability in how I understood my own mind. But over time, things became more manageable. With support, treatment, and a better understanding of what was happening internally, I began to regain a sense of control and clarity. I learned to recognize warning signs earlier, to separate intense internal experiences from external reality, and to manage my condition in a way that allowed me to live more steadily. Looking back now, the moment in the ocean is not something I interpret in a supernatural or literal way. I understand it differently today. I understand it as a moment where panic, perception, and mental stress collided in a very intense environment, creating an experience that felt far more overwhelming than it actually was externally. What stands out to me now is not just that day itself, but how it connects to a larger understanding of my own mind over time. It wasn't one isolated incident that defined everything. It was part of a longer journey of learning what was happening within me and how to work with it instead of against it. I still think about that day sometimes, especially when I think about how unpredictable perception can be under stress. The ocean, which once felt like something frightening in that moment, is now more of a reminder of how powerful the mind can be when it is overwhelmed. I don't avoid it because of fear in the same way anymore, but I do have a respect for how quickly experience can shift depending on mental state. And more than anything, I've learned that understanding yourself properly takes time. Sometimes much more time than you expect. When I was around 4 years old, my older brother was about 11. And our family was going through a temporary phase where we didn't have a stable home of our own. During that period, we stayed at my aunt's house for a few weeks. It was not something that felt strange or dramatic at the time. For me, as a small child, life simply continued wherever I was placed. I didn't think about long-term plans or what was happening behind the scenes. I just accepted the place we were in as normal and followed the daily rhythm created by the adults around me. My aunt's house was in a quiet residential neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of place where anything ever seemed out of place. The streets were calm, lined with similar-looking homes, and there was a sense of routine life everywhere you looked. People would sometimes sit outside in the evenings, children would play in front yards or on sidewalks, and neighbors would occasionally greet each other when they passed by. Nothing about it felt unsafe or unusual. It was the type of environment where everything seems predictable, where you assume everyone around you is just living a normal, peaceful life. During the time we stayed there, I remember how simple everything felt from my perspective. Days were mostly shaped around basic routines like meals, naps, and short moments of play. Adults were busy with their own conversations and responsibilities, and children naturally found ways to entertain themselves. There was nothing in my mind that suggested anything complicated or worrying about the world around me. It was just a temporary home, and to me that was all it needed to be. And next door to my aunt's house lived a family with a son who was around my brother's age. Because of this, my brother naturally started spending time with him. It wasn't anything planned or organized. There were no formal introductions or arrangements. It was just the kind of connection that happens easily when children live close to each other. They would meet outside, play simple games, and move between the two houses without much thought. From what I remember hearing later, it was a very ordinary friendship, the kind that forms quickly during childhood and doesn't feel significant at the time. My brother would often go over during the day, sometimes after lunch or in the afternoon when there wasn't much else happening. He would knock on the door, and most of the time, the children or their mother would answer. It was all very casual and normal. There was no reason for anyone to think twice about it. In neighborhoods like that, it was common for children to move freely between nearby houses, especially when families knew each other, at least on a basic level. One afternoon stands out because of what we later learned about it, although at the time, it felt completely ordinary. My brother had gone next door as he usually did. It was a normal part of his day. There was nothing unusual in his behavior, no hesitation, no sense that anything was different. He simply walked over and knocked on the door. This time, however, it was not the children or the mother who answered. It was the father of the house. He told my brother in a calm and casual way that his wife and children were not at home because they had gone out shopping. His tone was relaxed, almost friendly, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. He then invited my brother inside. He offered him something to drink, juice if I remember correctly, and suggested that he sit down for a while. There was nothing in his behavior that would have made a child feel alarmed. He spoke politely, asked simple questions, and carried himself like a normal neighbor being hospitable. From my brother's point of view, there was no reason to feel uncomfortable. Everything seemed normal on the surface. Adults often behave in friendly ways toward children in neighborhood settings, and this would not have seemed unusual. So he accepted the invitation and went inside. He sat down and had a drink. The man spoke with him for a while, asking general questions, probably about school or family or simple everyday things. I and my brother responded normally. There was nothing intense or emotional about the interaction. It was just a short visit inside a neighbor's house. The atmosphere, at least from what he later understood and remembered, felt ordinary and calm. There was no visible sign of anything being wrong, nothing that would have caused concern in that moment. Time passed in a simple way, the kind of way it does during a casual visit. Eventually, my brother left and returned to my aunt's house. He came back without mentioning anything unusual. To him, it was just part of the day, something that didn't carry any special meaning. Life continued as normal afterward, and the rest of the afternoon passed without any disruption. For everyone else as well, there was no immediate reason to think anything was wrong. The neighborhood remained quiet. People went on with their routines. The house next door looked the same as it always did from the outside. There was nothing visible that suggested anything disturbing was happening behind closed doors. But a few days later, that sense of normal life changed completely. There was sudden activity in the neighborhood. Police cars arrived, and the usual calm atmosphere of the street shifted into something tense and unsettling. People began stepping outside their homes, looking around, trying to understand what was going on. Conversations started happening in low, confused tones. It was clear that something serious had taken place, but no one had full information at first. As the situation became clearer, the truth slowly came out. It was revealed that the man who lived next door had killed his wife and his children. The news spread through the neighborhood in a way that felt almost unreal. It was the kind of information that is difficult to process immediately. because it clashes so strongly with how everything had appeared just days before. The same house that had looked ordinary and quiet was now connected to something deeply tragic and disturbing. And then came the detail that made the situation even harder to think about later. It turned out that during the same period, when my brother had visited that house, the man had already killed his family and was in the process of burying their bodies in the backyard. That realization changes the way the entire memory is understood, because in the moment it happened, none of that reality was visible. There were no signs from the outside, no warnings, and no indication that anything so serious was taking place inside. From the outside, it was just a normal house in a normal neighborhood. A child had walked in, had a drink, spoken briefly with an adult, and then walked back out again. But behind that surface, something completely different was happening at the same time. When you think about it afterward, the most unsettling part is how ordinary everything seemed. There was nothing dramatic or strange about the interaction itself. No moment that stood out as suspicious or alarming. It was just a small part of a normal day. And yet, unknown to everyone involved, it existed alongside something unthinkable. It makes you reflect on how limited our awareness really is in everyday life. People move through spaces believing they understand them, believing that what they see is the full picture. A quiet street feels safe. A friendly neighbor seems normal. A casual conversation feels meaningless in the moment. But in reality, there is always more happening than what can be seen from the outside. For my brother, there was no awareness at the time that anything was wrong. He simply experienced a short visit, a drink, a conversation, and then he came home. There was no fear, no warning, no reason to think otherwise. Only later did that moment take on a completely different meaning when the truth about the house was revealed. Afterward, when the story was known, it naturally became something people thought about quietly. Not in a dramatic or emotional way every day, but as a lingering awareness in the background. The idea that something so serious had been happening at the exact same time as such a normal interaction is not easy to fully separate from once you know it. It also brings a strange sense of reflection about timing and chance. How small differences in timing can place someone in or out of a situation without any awareness. If the visit had been longer or shorter, if the timing had shifted slightly, the overlap between those two realities might have been different. These thoughts don't change what happened, but they naturally come when you look back on events like this. In the end, my brother left that house safely, unaware of anything happening behind the scenes. And that is the part that stays with you. Not because something happened directly to him, but because of how close ordinary life can come to something unthinkable without any visible warning at all. It remains one of those memories that doesn't feel loud or dramatic in how it is told, but instead quiet and heavy in meaning. A reminder that everyday moments can exist right next to things no one would ever expect, and that most of the time, people only understand the full picture after everything has already passed. When I was younger, we lived across the street from a large family. From the outside, they seemed like a completely normal household, the kind of family you would see every day without thinking much about them. The father, the mother, and their 5 sons all lived together in one house, and there was always some kind of activity going on. Kids coming in and out, noise in the evenings, and the usual signs of a busy home. Nothing about them stood out in any unusual way, at least not from what anyone on the street could see. At that age, I didn't really understand the deeper details of people's lives. A family was just a family to me. You see them, you recognize them, and that's it. You don't think about what goes on inside their home or what kind of struggles they might be facing. Everything just looks normal from the outside because that is all a child can really observe. The father of that house was someone I remember seeing around often. He seemed like a typical parent, someone managing a big household with several children. With 5 sons, there was always movement and energy coming from that home. Sometimes they would be outside playing. Sometimes the older boys would be helping with small things around the house. It looked like a busy but ordinary family life, the kind you don't question. Life in our street felt predictable. People would go to work in the morning, children would play outside in the afternoons, and evenings were usually quiet. Families might sit in their front yards or just stay inside with their routines. There was a sense of familiarity where you recognize faces even if you don't talk to them often. That was the environment we were living in at the time. Because of that, nothing prepared anyone for what eventually happened. It was one night when everything changed. At first, there was no warning, no unusual signs during the day, nothing that would make anyone think something was wrong inside that house. The family had been seen earlier like any other normal day. There was no visible disturbance, no indication of what was going on behind closed doors. But later that night, something tragic happened inside their home. The father gathered his family in the living room, and in a moment that shocked everyone who later heard about it, he took his own life using a firearm. It happened suddenly. He, without any public understanding of what had been going through his mind before that moment. The details were not something people talked about openly at first because it was too heavy for the neighborhood to process. News like that doesn't feel real when you first hear it. It spreads slowly, through whispers and conversations between adults who are trying to understand something that makes no sense to them. When the truth became known, the entire street felt different. The house that once seemed normal suddenly became a place everyone looked at with silence. People would pass by more quietly. Some would avoid looking at it altogether. There was a heaviness in the air that wasn't there before, like the entire environment had changed overnight. But the most heartbreaking part of the situation was not just what had happened to the father. It was what it meant for the children. The 5 sons were left to deal with something that no child should ever have to process. Their lives, which had been ordinary just hours before, were suddenly broken into something completely different. Everything they understood about their home and their family changed in a single moment. And even though life continued for the rest of the neighborhood, for them, nothing would ever feel the same again. Children are deeply affected by experiences like that, especially when they are young. They don't just forget or move on easily. Things like that stay with them in ways that shape how they see the world. Safety, trust, and stability all become harder to understand after something so sudden and traumatic happens inside a home. In the days that followed, the atmosphere on the street felt different. There was a quiet sadness that hung over everything. People talked in low voices. Conversations often stopped when children were nearby. Adults didn't always know what to say because there are some events that don't have easy explanations. For a long time afterward, that house carried a kind of silence. Not an empty silence, but the kind that comes after something deeply upsetting has taken place. Even normal sounds from inside it felt different to those who remembered what had happened. What stayed with people most was the contrast between how normal everything looked before and how devastating the truth turned out to be. There were no visible warnings from the outside, no clear signs that something was going wrong. It was just a regular family living their lives across the street, the same as many others in the area. That contrast is what makes memories like this so difficult to fully understand even years later. The human mind naturally expects that serious things will come with signs, that you will be able to recognize when something is wrong. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes everything appears completely normal, right up until the moment it is not. As time passed, the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. People continued their routines. Children played outside again. Life didn't stop because life rarely stops for any single event, no matter how painful it is. But for those who remembered that night, there was always a lingering awareness attached to that house. It was not something people openly discussed all the time, but it stayed in the background of memory. A reminder that even familiar places can hold moments of deep tragedy that are invisible from the outside. For me personally, even though I was young at the time, the story stayed in my mind as I grew older. Not in a sharp or disturbing way, but as a quiet understanding of how unpredictable life can be. When you are a child, you assume that homes are safe and stable just because they look that way. You assume that families are fine if they appear normal in public. But experiences like this slowly change that way of thinking. It teaches you that what you see on the surface is not always the full truth. People can be going through things that are completely hidden from everyone around them. A house can look peaceful while carrying pain that no one outside is aware of. And sometimes, those hidden struggles can lead to moments that affect not just one person, but an entire family and community. The children from that house had to grow up carrying something that most people can never fully understand. Their lives were shaped by an event they had no control over, something that happened in their own home and changed everything in an instant. For the rest of the neighborhood, it was a shocking memory. For them, it became a part of their life story that they had to carry forward. Even now, when people who remember that time think about it, there is a quiet sense of reflection that comes with it. Not loud or dramatic, but steady and thoughtful. It is the kind of memory that makes you pause for a moment and think about how fragile stability can be, and how quickly normal life can change without warning. In the end, the street continued, the houses remained, and life moved forward as it always does. But that one moment became something that stayed in the background of memory for everyone who knew about it. A reminder that even in places that feel safe and familiar, there can be stories hidden underneath that no one sees until it is too late. When I was about 9 years old, I remember spending a long summer afternoon at the school, just a short walk from my house. It was one of those bright, heavy summer days where the sun feels like it never moves, and the air stays warm even when you stop running around. Kids in the neighborhood usually gathered there because it was familiar, open, and felt safe in the way childhood places often do when you don't question them yet. Everything about that day felt ordinary at first. The kind of memory that would normally fade into the background of childhood without standing out at all. I was there with a friend, and we were just passing time near the playground. There wasn't anything special happening. Some of the older boys were playing street hockey nearby, their sticks hitting the ground and the ball rolling fast across the pavement. We were mostly just watching and talking, doing what kids do when they don't have a plan and don't need one. The school building was behind us, and the parking lot was off to the side, partly hidden from where we stood. It felt like a normal, safe environment where nothing unexpected ever really happened. At some point, one of the boys playing hockey called out my name. I still remember how casual it sounded, like it was just part of the game or a passing comment. He said that someone in the parking lot was looking for me. That immediately caught my attention. As a child, the idea that an adult might be looking for you carries a strange kind of importance. It doesn't immediately feel dangerous. It feels like you are needed somewhere, or that something involves you personally. I turned my head toward the parking lot. From where I stood, I couldn't see everything clearly because the school building blocked most of the view, but I could make out the shape of an old van parked there. It didn't look like the cars that usually came and went from the school. It had that older, slightly worn appearance, the kind of van you might associate with another time. I don't remember noticing it earlier that day, which is part of why it stayed in my mind even then, though I didn't fully understand why. For a moment, I just stood there trying to process what I had been told. It didn't feel alarming. If anything, it felt a little confusing and curious. I didn't ask many questions. At that age, you often don't pause to analyze things deeply, especially when the message seems simple and directed at you. I remember thinking that maybe it was someone who knew me, or someone from the school, or some kind of harmless misunderstanding that I would quickly resolve by just walking over and seeing what it was about. So I started walking slowly in the direction of the parking lot. I wasn't running or rushing. There was no fear in my body at that moment, only a mild sense of curiosity. I think that is something I only fully understand now, looking back. Children don't always interpret situations through danger. They interpret them through relevance. If something's about you, you go toward it. That's what I was doing without thinking much about it, but I didn't get very far. Before I reached the parking lot, someone else stepped into the situation. The mother of one of the other children had come looking for her son. She must have noticed movement or something that didn't look right from a distance, because she approached quickly. I remember her asking me what I was doing, her tone direct but not unkind. I told her exactly what I had been told, that a man in the van was looking for me. The change in her reaction was immediate. It wasn't gradual or uncertain. It was as if something clicked for her in an instant that I did not yet understand. She didn't stop to discuss it or look around for confirmation. She simply reached out, took my hand, and turned me away from the parking lot. There was a firm urgency in the way she moved, a kind of protective certainty that I only recognize now as adult instinct responding to risk. As she pulled me away, I remember something else happening almost at the same time. The van that I had been walking toward suddenly started moving. It didn't slowly reverse or casually leave. It pulled out quickly, almost abruptly, and drove away from the area. The timing of it stayed with me. It felt like everything shifted in the moment. Attention was drawn toward it, as if the situation dissolved as soon as another adult became involved. At the time, I didn't fully understand what that meant. I just remember watching it leave and feeling a strange mix of confusion and emptiness, like something had been interrupted without explanation. There was no confrontation, no conversation, nothing clear enough for a child to label as important. It simply ended, just like that. The woman then walked me back toward my home. I don't remember much of what was said during that walk. I think there may have been some brief questions, but mostly I remember silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a serious one. The kind of silence adults carry when they are thinking about something a child doesn't yet understand. I remember looking at the ground as we walked, trying to make sense of why everything suddenly felt different when nothing had actually happened from my point of view. When I got home, I told my parents what had occurred. Their reaction was very different from mine. They didn't treat it like a small or strange coincidence. Instead, it immediately became something serious. I didn't understand the full reason at the time, but I remember that after that day, I wasn't allowed to go out on my own for the rest of the summer. That restriction frustrated me deeply. To me, nothing had actually gone wrong. I hadn't been harmed. I hadn't even reached the van. So from my perspective as a child, the reaction felt unfair and unnecessary. For a long time, I held on to that feeling of confusion. It didn't make sense to me why such a simple moment had led to such a strong response from adults. I continued thinking about it occasionally, but mostly I moved on with childhood as children do. Other memories replaced it, and life kept going. It wasn't until years later, when I was much older and able to understand behavior and intention in a more complete way, that the memory began to take on a different shape. Looking back as an adult, I started to see details that I had not fully processed at the time. The fact that the message came through another child. The fact that the person in the van did not approach directly. The fact that I was being called away from a public, visible space toward something more isolated. These pieces began to form a pattern that I now interpret very differently. What stands out most to me now is how ordinary everything looked on the surface. If someone had passed by that school that day, they would have seen nothing unusual at first glance. Children playing, a game of street hockey, a parked vehicle that might not have drawn attention, and a child walking slowly across a familiar space. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously wrong, and yet underneath that normal appearance, something was not right. I also think a lot about the mother who intervened. At the time, I didn't understand her urgency or why she reacted so strongly. I thought she was simply stopping me from doing something unnecessary or confusing. But now I realize that her reaction was likely based on experience, awareness, and instinct. She saw something that didn't fit, even if it was subtle, and she acted immediately without waiting for confirmation. That decision changed everything about how that moment ended. Even now, what stays with me is how close the situation came to going in a very different direction without anyone realizing it in time. I didn't recognize danger because nothing obvious was shown to me as danger. It was quiet, indirect, and easy to misunderstand. That is what makes it more unsettling in hindsight. It didn't look like something serious until someone with more awareness stepped in. There is also a part of the memory that will always remain uncertain. I will never know exactly who was in that van or what the intention truly was. That lack of closure is part of why the moment stays in my mind even now. It is not a complete story with a clear ending. It is a fragment of time that only became meaningful much later when I could understand how easily outcomes can shift based on small actions. Looking back, I realized that what happened that day wasn't defined by what occurred, but by what was prevented. At the time, I only experienced confusion and interruption. I didn't experience the full weight of what might have been happening. But with age and understanding, I can now see how fragile that moment was, and how much depended on someone noticing something I couldn't see. In the end, it remains one of those childhood memories that becomes clearer with distance. Not because it was understood at the time, but because understanding came slowly later, shaped by experience and perspective. What once felt like a confusing interruption now feels like a moment where things could have gone very differently, and didn't, for reasons I am quietly grateful for even now. When I was in first grade, around 7 or 8 years old, something happened that I still remember very clearly even today. It was just an ordinary school day. The kind that feels simple and predictable when you are that young. Nothing about it stood out in the morning. I went to school like usual, spent my day in class, and by the time the bell rang, I was already thinking about going home the same way I always did. I used to walk home on my own most days. It was normal for me, and I was comfortable with it. My routine never really changed. If someone was going to pick me up, it would usually be my mother. That was just how things worked in my family. So I never expected anything different, and I never had a reason to think otherwise. When the school ended that day, I left the building like I always did. The area around the school felt familiar in every way. There were other children around, some laughing and talking loudly, some waiting for their parents, and some already walking away in different directions. It was the kind of scene that repeats itself every day, where nothing feels out of place and your mind is completely relaxed. I was just blending into that normal flow, walking out like any other day, when something unexpected happened. A man approached me and stopped me. At first I didn't think much of it. Adults sometimes talk to children near schools for harmless reasons, and I didn't immediately feel alarmed. But then he said something that made me pause completely. He said, "Elixir, your dad sent me to get you." Hearing my name made me stop for a moment. When you are that young, hearing a stranger use your name feels strangely important. It grabs your attention in a way you don't fully understand. But at the same time, the sentence itself didn't make sense to me. My father had never arranged anything like that. And in our routine, if anything ever changed, it was always my mother who would come for me. So what he was saying didn't fit with anything I knew about my life. I remember looking at him and asking, "My dad sent you?" I said it calmly, but there was confusion in my voice. I wasn't being rude or defensive. I was simply trying to understand if what I heard was actually correct. At that age, you try to process things slowly, especially when something doesn't match your normal experience. He responded quickly. He said something like, "Yes, your dad, the very specific job." Even as a child, that answer didn't make things clearer. In fact, it made everything more confusing. The way he spoke didn't feel connected to anything familiar. There was no detail that made sense to me, no explanation that matched how adults in my life usually communicated. It felt off in a way I couldn't properly describe even then. I didn't stand there thinking for long. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't try to figure it out. Something inside me shifted very quickly, even if I couldn't explain it at the time. It wasn't a logical decision. It was more like a sudden feeling that told me I shouldn't stay there. And without fully understanding why, I turned around and started running. I ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to see what he would do next. I just moved. It felt like my body reacted before my mind caught up. There was no plan, no thinking process, just a strong instinct pushing me forward. I kept running until I reached my home. When I got there, I remember feeling a mix of relief and confusion. I was safe, but I didn't fully understand what had just happened. It didn't feel like a dramatic event in my mind at that moment. It just felt strange, like something that didn't belong in my normal day. My mother was at home, and I told her everything right away. I explained how a man had stopped me, what he had said, and how it had made me uncomfortable enough to run home. As I was speaking, I could see her expression change immediately. She didn't treat it like something minor or uncertain. She didn't ask me to ignore it or brush it off. She became serious in an instant, and I could feel the shift in the atmosphere in the house. Without wasting time, she called the police. After that, things moved very quickly into a more serious direction. Adults started discussing it in a tone I wasn't used to hearing. I didn't understand all the details, but I could tell that what I had experienced mattered more than I realized. It wasn't just a random encounter anymore in their eyes. It was something important enough to report and investigate. In the following days, my routine changed completely. My mother started walking me to school and picking me up herself. I no longer walked alone. At that age, I didn't question it deeply. I just accepted it as a change in how things were done. But I could still sense that it wasn't just a simple adjustment. It was a response to something serious. As time passed and I grew older, I started to understand the situation more clearly. When I was 7 or 8, I only knew the basic parts of the story. A man had spoken to me, I had felt uncomfortable, and I had run home. That was the extent of my understanding back then. But later, with age and awareness, I began to realize how easily that moment could have turned out differently. If I had believed him without question, or if I had decided to follow instead of running, the outcome could have been something entirely unknown. What still stands out to me most is how normal everything looked at the beginning. There was nothing about that day that felt unusual or dangerous. It was just another school day ending like every other. That is what makes the memory so unsettling in hindsight. Nothing around me suggested anything was wrong, and yet something clearly was. I also think about the decision I made in that moment to run. At the time, it didn't feel like a decision at all. It felt automatic, like something inside me reacted before I could think it through. Looking back now, I understand how important that reaction was. It changed everything. There is also something unresolved about the memory that never fully goes away. I never found out who that man really was or what his true intention might have been. There was no ending where everything became clear. It simply stopped the moment I ran away, leaving that part of the story unanswered. Over time, the memory stopped being just something scary and became something I learned from. It made me more aware of how important it is to trust your instincts, especially when something feels off, even if you cannot explain why. When you are a child, you tend to trust words easily and assume everything is as it sounds. But life teaches you that not everything is what it appears to be. Even now, what I remember most is how a completely ordinary day almost shifted into something very different because of a single encounter. It didn't feel dramatic at the time, just confusing and slightly strange. But looking back, I understand how significant that moment really was, and in a way, I am still grateful for how it ended. Not because of what happened, but because I listened to that inner instinct and chose to run home instead of going anywhere else. When I was 12 years old, something happened that still sits clearly in my memory, almost like it is stored in a part of my mind that never fades. It is not something I think about every day, but when it does come back, it feels just as real as it did in that moment. It was one of those situations that seemed completely normal at first, the kind of ordinary day that doesn't stand out while it is happening. Only later do you realize how different things could have been if even one small detail had changed. That day, I was at the emergency room with my mom. She wasn't feeling well, and we had gone there so she could get checked by a doctor. The hospital was one of those places that always feels heavy, even if nothing extremely serious is happening. As a child, I remember it feeling even more intense. The lighting was too bright in some areas and too dim in others. The air felt a bit cold, and there was always this constant background noise of movement, footsteps, doors opening and closing, and distant voices echoing through hallways. People were everywhere. Some looked worried, some looked tired, and some just sat silently waiting for their turn. Nurses moved quickly from one place to another, holding files or speaking softly into clipboards. Doctors occasionally passed by with serious expressions, and even though I didn't fully understand what was going on, I could feel that this was a place where something important was always happening. I stayed close to my mom most of the time. She was sitting in the waiting area, trying to rest and recover a bit while we waited for updates. At one point, she suddenly remembered that she needed some paperwork from the car. I don't remember exactly what it was for, maybe insurance papers or some documents she had brought with her, but she asked me if I could go and get them. To me, it felt like a very simple task. Nothing about it seemed dangerous or unusual. We were still inside the hospital building, and the parking lot was just a short walk away. I was 12 years old, and at that age, you don't really think deeply about risks in situations like that. You just think about completing the task quickly and getting back. So I agreed and started walking out of the hospital. The moment I stepped outside, the atmosphere changed slightly. Inside the hospital, everything felt controlled and closed, but outside there was more space, more movement, and a bit of more noise. The parking lot was fairly busy. Cars were slowly moving in and out. People were walking toward the entrance with hospital bags, and others were leaving after their visits. It had that typical hospital parking lot feeling where everyone seems focused on their own purpose, not really paying attention to anything else. I remember the sun was not too strong that day, but the light outside felt sharper after being inside for a while. I didn't feel nervous at all. In fact, I felt quite normal, even slightly independent, like I was trusted with an important little responsibility. I just needed to find our car, grab the papers, and go back inside. As I was walking, I was thinking about nothing in particular. Just small things a child might think about, like getting back quickly so my mom wouldn't have to wait too long. I remember scanning the rows of cars, trying to recognize ours. Then, suddenly, I heard voices from a distance. At first, I didn't really pay attention. The parking lot had many sounds, so it didn't stand out immediately. But then I noticed the tone. It was sharper, more urgent than normal conversation. I turned my head slightly and saw a group of women standing outside the hospital entrance area. They were looking in my direction. One of them was waving her hand slightly, and all of them looked tense. Their voices were raised, and even though I couldn't hear every word clearly, I started picking up fragments. It took a few seconds for my mind to connect what they were saying. "What are you doing? Hey, stop! Stay away from that little girl!" Those words should have meant something to me immediately, but they didn't. I think my brain simply didn't process that they were talking about me. I was too focused on my task, too focused on finding the car. I remember feeling slightly confused, but not alarmed. It was like hearing background noise that didn't belong to me. So I kept walking. That part still feels strange when I think about it now. Even though people were clearly trying to warn someone, I didn't understand that I was the reason. I didn't feel like anything was wrong. I just continued forward, moving between cars looking for the familiar shape of our vehicle. When I finally found it, I remember feeling a small sense of relief. I went closer, checking where my mom might have kept the papers. Everything still felt normal. The world around me hadn't changed in my mind. It was just a simple errand, nothing more. Yeah, but then something shifted very quickly. As I stood there near the car, I paused for a moment and looked around again. That is when I saw my mom. She was walking toward me from the direction of the hospital entrance. And behind me, just a few steps away, I suddenly noticed a man. I hadn't seen him approach. I don't know how long he had been there, but in that moment, it felt like he appeared out of nowhere. It was closer than I expected. And the moment I became aware of him, something inside me changed. It was not full fear, but a sudden alertness, like my mind had finally caught up to something it had missed earlier. At the same time, my mom also saw him. I still remember her expression very clearly. It changed instantly. There was no confusion on her face, no hesitation, no delay in understanding. It was immediate focus. The kind of look a parent gets when something does not feel right about a situation involving their child. She walked directly toward us, faster than before, her attention completely locked onto the man. She asked him straight away what he was doing. The man tried to respond quickly. He said something about just wanting to ask me for a ride. Even at 12 years old, I remember thinking how strange that sounded. It didn't make sense in that environment. A hospital parking lot, a child alone, and a stranger asking for a ride from a kid. It didn't fit together logically. My mom didn't pause to think about it. Her voice changed immediately, becoming firm and sharp. She looked at him directly and said something like, "Does she look old enough to give you a ride?" There was no aggression in her tone, but there was complete authority. No uncertainty at all. Just protection, clear and immediate. For a second, everything felt still. The man didn't argue further. He didn't try to explain again. He didn't push the situation. Instead, he took a step back, then another. It was as if he suddenly realized the situation was no longer in his control. Within moments, he turned away and quickly walked off, disappearing between the cars and people in the parking lot. Just like that, the situation ended. But for me, it didn't fully feel like it ended at that moment. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. My mind was still catching up. I looked at my mom, then at the direction the man had gone, and then back at the parking lot where everything looked completely normal again. Cars were still moving. People were still walking. The world had not changed, but something in me felt different. I didn't fully understand the seriousness of it at that age. I just felt confused, slightly shaken, like I had missed something important that had been happening right beside me without my awareness. Later, when I thought about it more deeply, I realized something that stayed with me. I hadn't recognized the danger at all while it was happening. I didn't understand the warnings from the women. I didn't notice the man approaching me. I didn't even interpret the urgency in the environment. I was completely focused on a simple task, and everything else just passed by me without being processed. And that realization has stayed with me over the years. Because when I look back now, I can see how easily the outcome could have been different. If those women hadn't noticed something unusual, if my mom had taken a few more minutes to come outside, if I had stayed distracted just a little longer. It wasn't just one thing that kept it safe. It was a chain of small moments aligning at exactly the right time, without anyone really planning it. As I grew older, I stopped thinking of it as just a strange childhood memory. It became more like a quiet lesson in awareness and timing. A reminder that not everything dangerous looks obvious in the moment. Sometimes things only make sense when you look back after they are already over. Even now, years later, I don't feel fear when I remember it. It is more of a calm reflection, a kind of understanding that safety is not always something you notice while it is happening. Sometimes it depends on small awareness, quick reactions, and people stepping in at the right moment without hesitation. And maybe that is why this memory never fully leaves me. Not because of what actually happened, but because of how close it came to being something completely different, without anyone realizing it at the time. When I interviewed her, she told me something she said she had never really been able to shake. Even after all these years, it wasn't just a childhood memory to her. It was the kind of experience that changes the way you think about fear, safety, and even your own imagination. She said it started when she was around 10 years old. At that age, she had trouble sleeping at night. It wasn't unusual childhood restlessness or just staying up too late. It was something deeper, a constant feeling that she wasn't alone in her room once the lights went out. She described it as a sense of being watched, even when everything was still and quiet. Her imagination, like many children's, filled in the gaps that darkness creates. And in her mind, she began to believe that the boogeyman was real, not as a playful idea or a story adults use to scare kids, but as something physically present in her house. In her mind, it lived in her closet. Every night felt the same to her. She would go to bed, try to fall asleep, and then slowly become more aware of the silence around her. The room would feel bigger than it was during the day. Shadows would seem deeper. And eventually, her attention would always drift toward the closet door. It was a normal wooden closet door, the kind most kids have in their rooms. But to her, it became the center of everything. She started believing that something was standing behind it, just waiting. Sometimes she thought she could hear small sounds like movement or breathing. Other times it was just a feeling so strong that she couldn't ignore it. She began waking up in the middle of the night and going downstairs to her parents' room. At first, her parents treated it like any other childhood fear. Her mother would comfort her, and her father would reassure her in a more practical way. He would tell her that there was no boogeyman, that it was just her imagination. and that she needed to go back to bed. He didn't show anger or frustration in the beginning. To him, it was just a phase many children go through, so she would go back upstairs. But the pattern didn't stop. Night after night, she would wake up again. Night after night, she would go downstairs. And every time, she would say the same thing in different words. That she couldn't sleep. That something was in her closet. That she was scared. Her father's response slowly began to change. Not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle shift that happens when someone is repeatedly interrupted in the middle of the night. The reassurance stayed the same, but the patience behind it started to wear thin. He would still tell her there was nothing there, but his tone became more tired each time. Eventually, it reached a point where he had heard it so many nights in a row that he stopped reacting with concern altogether. One night, after she came down again, he didn't even fully get out of bed at first. He told her firmly but casually that there was no boogeyman, that she needed to stop imagining things, and that she should go back to sleep. It was the kind of response a parent gives when they believe the issue is only in the child's mind and nothing more. But that night, she was more distressed than usual. She kept insisting that it wasn't just imagination, that she could feel it, that it was real, that it was in her closet again. Her father finally got up. There was a kind of exhausted determination in him at that point. The kind that comes from wanting to prove a point once and for all, so the situation can finally end. He decided that instead of just telling her, he would show her. He would physically open the closet and prove that there was nothing inside. He took her by the hand and walked her back upstairs to her room. The house was quiet in that late-night way where everything feels heavier. The hallway lights were dim, and the air felt still. She remembers walking behind him, still scared, still convinced that something was wrong, but also trusting that her father was strong enough to fix it. When they entered her room, he turned on the light. The sudden brightness made everything feel sharper and more real. The bed, the walls, the small objects in the room all looked completely normal. For a moment, it was just an ordinary child's bedroom again. But her fear didn't go away. It stayed focused on the closet. Her father noticed where she was looking. He let out a small breath, the kind people do when they are about to end a long argument. Then he said something like, "I'll show you. There's no boogeyman." He walked toward the closet door. At that moment, she stood a few steps behind him near the bed, watching carefully. She later said she remembers feeling both relief and fear at the same time. Relief because she believed he would prove her wrong, and fear because a part of her still felt certain that something wasn't right. Her father reached for the closet handle, and then something strange happened. The door didn't open easily. At first, he assumed it was just stuck or maybe jammed slightly, which can happen with older doors. He pulled again, a bit stronger this time, but it still didn't move properly. It felt like something on the other side was holding it shut. That detail changed everything in an instant. Her father stopped for a moment. The tiredness he had been feeling earlier disappeared almost immediately, replaced by alertness. He tried again, more firmly this time. The resistance didn't make sense. It wasn't just a stuck door. It felt like there was actual pressure from the other side. He turned slightly and told his daughter to leave the room. She remembers that moment very clearly. The shift in his voice, the sudden seriousness. Without arguing, she immediately went out into the hallway, standing just outside her bedroom door. Now it was just him inside the room. He stared at the closet for a brief moment, and then he pulled the door open with force. What he saw inside was not what any parent expects to find in a child's closet. There was a man. He was hiding inside the closet space, trying to stay concealed. The situation was so unexpected and wrong that it took a second for the reality of it to fully register. This wasn't a child's imagination. This wasn't fear or dreams or nighttime anxiety. There was someone actually there, in the house, in the child's room, hiding in the closet. Everything after that happened very quickly. Her father reacted immediately, driven by shock and anger. The calm, tired parent from earlier was gone. What replaced him was instinct and pure protective reaction. He pulled the man out of the closet and physically confronted him. She didn't see the details of what happened inside the room, but she said she could hear the chaos from the hallway, the struggle, the raised voices, the sound of something serious unfolding behind the closed door. Within moments, it was over. The man was forced out of the room and restrained until the situation was under control. The police were called, and he was taken into custody. Later, it was discovered that the man had been entering the house secretly at night. He had been hiding inside the home without the family knowing, and according to what was later understood, he had been coming into the girl's room and staying there while she slept. The closet had been his hiding place, a space where he thought he wouldn't be discovered. It was a violation of safety that went far beyond what anyone expects to imagine happening inside their own home. The man was arrested, charged, and eventually sent to prison. For the girl, the experience didn't end when the police left or when the house became quiet again. The fear she had felt before suddenly took on a completely different meaning. What she had believed was a childhood fear of monsters turned out to be something real, something far more disturbing than her imagination had ever created on its own. The closet, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, it all had a real source. And that realization changed how she saw fear forever. She told me that for a long time after that night, she couldn't look at closed doors the same way. Even simple things like dark rooms or quiet houses felt different. Not because she was constantly afraid, but because she now understood that sometimes fear is not just something your mind invents. Sometimes it is your mind noticing something before you can explain it. What stayed with her father, she said, was something different. It was the memory of how easily he had dismissed her fear at first. Not because he was careless, but because it sounded like something every child says at some point. A harmless imagination. A phase. Something to grow out of. But in this case, it wasn't just imagination. That realization stayed with him long after the incident. When I later looked into the case, just out of curiosity, I found something that made the entire story feel even heavier. The man had served time, but after being released on parole, he had failed to show up for required check-ins. There was a warrant out for his arrest again, and at the time of my interview, no one knew where he was. That detail added a final layer of unease to an already unsettling story, because it meant the situation in some way had never fully closed. And for her, even years later, the memory wasn't just about fear or childhood imagination. It was about how thin the line can sometimes be between something that feels unreal and something that turns out to be very, very real. When I was very young, my mom and I were living in a small, single-wide trailer in a rough trailer park. Life wasn't easy for her back then. She was a single mother trying to hold everything together while working 2 jobs and attending cosmetology school after my dad left. Most of the time, she was running on very little sleep, constantly moving between work, school, and taking care of me. It was the kind of life where there was no real pause, just survival and routine. Because of her night shifts, I often stayed overnight at my aunt's houses. It became normal for me to switch between homes depending on her schedule. I didn't really question it at the time. That was just how life worked for us. Some nights I was with my mom, other nights with family, and then back again when she could pick me up. One morning, she picked me up from my aunt's house around 7 a.m., and we went back to our trailer. I still remember arriving that day. There was nothing obviously wrong, Nothing that should have felt unusual, but something about it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, just a strange feeling I didn't understand as a child. I didn't want to go inside. I kept asking if I could stay outside instead and ride my bike for a while. My mom was extremely tired. You could see it in the way she moved and the way she spoke. She had that deep exhaustion that doesn't go away after a single night of sleep. She just wanted to rest for a bit before starting another long shift of responsibilities. Still, we went inside together, and she immediately lay down on the bed, trying to get a few minutes of sleep. At first, I sat in front of the TV watching Barney. It was a quiet morning, the kind that feels normal in the moment and forgettable later. The room was dim, the TV played softly, and everything felt slow. But I couldn't settle. I kept going back and forth, asking if I could go outside and ride my bike. I was restless, full of energy, and not really aware of how exhausted my mom actually was. We usually kept my bike inside my room because outside wasn't safe. If it was left out, it would get stolen quickly. That was just another part of life there, something we accepted without question. After some time, I stopped insisting on going outside and instead asked if I could just lie next to her. I didn't want to be alone in another room, so I climbed into bed beside her. She didn't say much. She was half asleep already, only trying to rest while I stayed close. For a while, everything was quiet. Just the sound of the TV in the background and the stillness of the morning. Then something happened that I still can't fully explain, even after all these years. Out of nowhere, I told my mom that there was someone in my closet and that he wanted to hurt me. There was no build-up to it. I don't remember seeing anything, hearing anything, or even thinking about it before saying it. It just came out suddenly, like a complete thought that didn't belong to the moment. Even now, I don't fully understand where it came from. As a child, I wasn't exposed to anything that would have created that idea. But I said it with certainty, as if I truly believed it. My mom immediately sat up. She didn't laugh, dismiss it, or question why I would say something like that. She just reacted. In a calm but serious way, she got up and said she was going to check. I stayed on the bed while she walked toward my room. The house was quiet. Too quiet in a way that made everything feel sharper. I remember listening to her footsteps as she moved down the short hallway. When she reached the doorway of my room, something changed instantly. The closet door in my room was one of those folding ones. It wasn't fully open, but it moved slightly. Not a normal movement, not something caused by air or the house settling. It shifted in a way that immediately caught her attention, like something behind it was blocking or pressing against it. In that moment, everything felt different. The silence wasn't normal anymore. It felt heavy. What neither of us knew yet was that someone had broken into our home. A man had entered the trailer while my mom was away. He was not a random intruder. He had a criminal background and had skipped bail while awaiting a new trial. He had been watching our routine for several days, learning when my mom left and when she returned. He had studied the pattern carefully, waiting for a moment when the trailer would be empty long enough for him to get inside without being seen. At some point, he had entered the house and gone straight into my room. He didn't just hide anywhere. He deliberately chose my space. He even took my bike and placed it inside the closet with him, planning something far more disturbing. The idea was that I would eventually come into the room, look for my bike, and get close enough for him to act. He was still inside the closet when my mom opened the door. But something had gone wrong with his plan. The bike's spokes had gotten caught on the small metal parts at the bottom of the folding closet door. That small, accidental snag prevented the door from opening properly. It also trapped him inside long enough that he couldn't immediately react when my mom approached the room. That tiny mechanical detail, something completely random and unplanned, ended up becoming the barrier between him and her in that moment. The second my mom realized something was wrong, she reacted instantly. She didn't go further into the room. She stepped back immediately, came straight to me, grabbed me, and we ran out of the trailer without hesitation. There was no time to think or investigate. It was pure instinct and urgency. We got into the car and left as quickly as we could. From there, we called for help and reported what had happened. By the time authorities arrived, the man had already managed to escape. He was gone before they could catch him. After that day, the trailer never felt the same again, even when nothing was happening, even when it was just an empty space with normal furniture and familiar walls. Something about it felt changed. It wasn't something I could explain as a child, but I could feel it. The sense of safety that should have been there was no longer the same. As I grew older and learned more about what had actually happened, the weight of it became clearer. It wasn't just a strange memory anymore. It was a situation that could have ended in a completely different way if even one small detail had changed. If my mom had been asleep for a little longer. If I hadn't said anything at all. If the closet had opened normally. So many small things aligned in a way that no one could have planned or predicted. And for me, even now, the memory carries a quiet, lingering impact. Not just because of what happened, but because of how close it came to becoming something irreversible. And how something as simple and random as a stuck bike part ended up changing everything without anyone ever realizing its importance in the moment. When I was a kid, I used to explore the forest near our house with my cousin. Thinking about those days now feels strange, almost like they didn't fully belong to the life I'm living today. It's like remembering a different version of myself, one that didn't understand how quickly ordinary moments can turn into something you never forget. The forest was located on a hill not too far from where we lived. From a distance, it always looked calm and even beautiful in its own quiet way. Tall trees stood closely together, their tops moving gently with the wind. The paths were uneven and sometimes hard to follow, but sunlight would still find its way through the branches, landing in soft patches on the ground. From afar, it almost felt inviting, like a place where nothing could really go wrong. But that impression always changed the moment you stepped closer. The deeper you went, the more the forest started to feel different. The ground became rougher, the silence heavier, and the trees seemed older and more tired. There were strange depressions scattered across the land, some small like shallow bowls in the earth, and others so large that standing at the edge made it hard to see what was at the bottom. We didn't understand everything about them back then, not in the way adults would. Later we learned they were remnants from bombs dropped during the world wars in Germany. But as children, we only understood the basics. They were not natural. They were not safe. And they were not something you should fall into. Still, knowledge like that doesn't stop children in the way adults might expect. It doesn't always create fear strong enough to keep you away. Instead, it blends with curiosity, with imagination, and with the feeling that maybe you will be careful enough to stay safe. That combination is powerful when you're young. It makes danger feel like something you can observe rather than something that can actually affect you. So we kept going back. Those trips became a kind of routine for us. Me and my cousin would treat them like small missions. Each visit to the forest felt slightly different depending on our mood or what we discovered. Sometimes we stayed on the easier paths, just walking, talking about random things the way kids do. Other times we would push a little further, choosing directions we hadn't tried before, as if the forest was a puzzle we were slowly solving. There was something exciting about it that we couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just about exploring trees or walking around. It felt like the forest had hidden layers, like there were things waiting to be found if you were brave or curious enough to look. Even when nothing unusual happened, the feeling of being there was enough to keep us coming back. One particular day started like all the others. The weather was calm, the forest quiet, and we were walking without any real plan. We were talking about small things at first, laughing about something that probably doesn't even make sense anymore, when I think about it now. The usual comfort of familiarity was there, that feeling that nothing unexpected would happen. But that changed when something caught our attention. At the bottom of one of the deeper craters, we saw something that didn't belong there at all. It was a backpack. At first, it didn't fully register in our minds. It stood out immediately, but our brains needed a moment to understand why. Everything around it looked old, rough, and natural in a way that only untouched places can be. Dirt, broken stone, wild grass growing in uneven patches. But the backpack looked completely different. It seemed modern, clean, and strangely intact, as if it had only recently been placed there. It didn't match the environment at all. We just stood there for a few moments, staring down without saying anything. It was one of those silences that happens when something feels slightly off, but you don't yet understand why. Our first thoughts were simple and logical in a childlike way. Maybe someone had dropped it. Maybe another kid had been here. No, maybe it was just forgotten. But the longer we looked, the more uncomfortable it felt. The crater itself wasn't easy to reach. The slope leading down was steep and unstable. Loose soil and small rocks shifted even when we only moved slightly at the edge. It gave the impression that the ground had no intention of staying in place if you trusted it too much. The backpack sat at the bottom like it was waiting, completely still, but in a way that made it feel strangely distant. We started talking about it, both of us trying to figure out what it could be. There was excitement in our voices at first, the kind that comes when something unusual appears in a place you thought you already knew well. It felt like an opportunity for another one of our small adventures. Something slightly risky, but interesting enough to pull us in. After a bit of hesitation, we tried to step down just a little, only enough to understand how difficult it would be. The moment our feet touched the slope, the ground shifted under us. Small stones rolled away quickly, disappearing further down the crater. It wasn't stable at all. Every movement felt uncertain, like the earth itself could give way without warning. That changed everything instantly. We stopped and went back up without needing to say much. Once we were safely at the top again, we just stood there, looking down at the backpack in silence. It still hadn't moved. It still looked strangely out of place, sitting in a spot that felt both close and unreachable at the same time. We kept thinking about what to do. Part of us still wanted to try again, maybe come up with a better way to reach it. But another part of us, the quieter and more careful part, started to understand that it wasn't worth the risk. It wasn't just a simple slope. One wrong step could easily turn into something dangerous. After a while of standing there and debating, we made a decision that felt reasonable at the time. We would come back later with something safer, maybe a rope, or anything that could help us get down without risking a fall. It felt like the responsible choice. The backpack wasn't going anywhere, and in our minds, waiting a day didn't seem like it would change anything. So we left. The walk back felt normal again, like the moment at the crater had already been filed away in our minds as something we would handle later. We went back to talking, slowly shifting our attention to other things. By the time we reached home, I had already felt like just another small part of our day, nothing urgent or alarming. That night, I remember thinking about it only briefly before falling asleep. I imagined how we might go back the next day, how we would solve the problem of getting it safely. There was no sense of fear, no feeling that something was wrong. It was just another unfinished curiosity sitting in the back of my mind. But the next morning brought something completely different. We heard a news report. A backpack had been found in the forest. Inside it were human remains. The report said it was discovered by a man who had been walking his dog. The dog had behaved strangely near one of the craters, refusing to move forward and reacting in a way that made the owner stop and pay attention. It kept pulling, barking, and focusing on a specific direction, as if something there was disturbing it. Eventually, the man followed the dog's behavior and investigated the area more closely. That decision led him down into the crater, and that is where he found the backpack. The same one we had seen the day before. Hearing that felt unreal. It was difficult to connect the calm memory of us standing at the edge, debating whether to come back later with something so serious and final. The place that had felt like a simple childhood exploration suddenly became something else entirely, something heavy and unsettling. We never returned to that forest again after that day. What stayed with me wasn't just the shock of the news, but the realization of how close we had been to something we didn't understand at all. At the time, it had felt like curiosity. Just two kids exploring. I'm making small decisions based on excitement and imagination. But looking back now, it feels different. It feels like we were standing at the edge of a moment we didn't have the awareness to fully grasp. A moment where a simple choice, something as ordinary as deciding to come back later, ended up separating us from something far more serious than we could have imagined. There was no dramatic warning, no obvious sign telling us to leave, just a quiet decision made in passing, followed by walking away without realizing what was truly there. And somehow, that was enough. It turned what could have become a very different memory into something that stayed only as a strange, unsettling reminder of how unpredictable life can be, especially when you are too young to understand what you are really looking at. My dad watched his brother drown when he was a child. He was too young at the time to understand what was happening fully, and even less able to do anything about it. He didn't know how to swim, and he didn't have the strength or knowledge to save him. That moment stayed with him for his entire life, even if he rarely spoke about it directly. He never told the story in detail when I was growing up. It wasn't something that came up in normal conversations, and it wasn't something he shared casually. Instead, it existed in the background of our home, like a quiet shadow that shaped the way he thought about water, safety, and responsibility. You could feel it in small ways, even if you didn't fully understand where it came from. Water was never treated like something simple in our family. It was never just a fun thing you played in during the summer, or a place for enjoyment without thought. For my dad, water carried a kind of seriousness that he never fully explained, but always expected us to respect. He didn't say it in dramatic words. He didn't need to. His behavior said everything for him. When I was a child, I didn't understand the depth of that history. I only knew the rules. One of those rules was that I had to learn how to swim properly. Not just casually, not just enough to float or splash around, but fully, step by step, through structured lessons. Completing 8 levels of swimming lessons was mandatory in our house. There was no negotiation, no skipping, and no shortcuts. It was treated like something as important as school itself. At the time, it just felt like another responsibility. Something my dad insisted on because he believed it was important. Like brushing your teeth or doing homework, it was simply part of life. I didn't question it much. I just followed it. The swimming lessons took place in a public pool not far from where we lived. I still remember the smell of chlorine when you first walked inside, sharp and clean in a way that felt slightly uncomfortable at first. The sound of water hitting the sides of the pool, the echo of voices bouncing off tiled walls, and the constant movement of instructors calling out instructions created a strange kind of environment that felt both organized and overwhelming. When I started, I was nervous in a way I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't fear exactly, just uncertainty. Being in water when you don't fully trust it is a strange feeling. Even shallow water can feel deeper than it really is when you don't feel in control. The first few levels were simple. Learning how to float, how to move your arms, how to kick your legs without panicking. The instructors were patient, repeating instructions calmly, guiding us step by step. Other children around me were going through the same process, some more confident than others. I remember watching them and trying to figure out how they made it look so easy. But for me, it never felt completely easy. There was always a small tension in the background, something I couldn't name at the time. I think now that it might have been connected to my dad's insistence, even though I didn't know the full reason behind it yet. It felt like this wasn't just a skill I was learning. It felt like something more serious was attached to it, even if no one said it out loud. As the levels increased, the lessons became more challenging. We moved from basic floating to actual swimming techniques, breathing control, and longer distances. There were moments when I felt proud, especially when I managed to complete a length of the pool without stopping. Those moments felt like small victories, like I was slowly building something important within myself. But there were also moments of discomfort, times when I swallowed water, lost rhythm, or panicked slightly in deeper sections. The instructors would always help, guiding us back to calmness, reminding us to breathe and stay steady. Over time, I learned to trust the process, even when it felt difficult. My dad would sometimes come to watch from the side of the pool. He never said much while watching. He would just stand there, observing quietly. His expression was hard to read, but there was always a seriousness in his eyes that I didn't fully understand back then. He wasn't like the other parents who smiled or waved. He was focused, almost distant, like he was watching something far beyond the present moment. After each lesson, he would simply ask how it went. Not in a casual way, but in a way that made it clear it mattered. If I said I was improving, he would nod. If I said I struggled, he would just tell me to keep going. There was no celebration, but also no disappointment. Just a steady expectation that I would continue. At the time, I thought he was just strict. I didn't realize that for him, this wasn't about discipline in the usual sense. It was about something much deeper. It wasn't until I got older that I started to understand. One day, when I was a teenager, he mentioned his brother in a conversation that wasn't planned or emotional. It came up naturally, almost accidentally, like a memory slipping through. He didn't go into detail, but he said enough for me to understand the outline of what had happened. When they were children, they were near water. Something went wrong. His brother ended up in the water, and my dad, being too young and unable to swim, couldn't save him. He tried, in the only way a child could try, but it wasn't enough. He didn't say much beyond that, just a few sentences. But those sentences carried a weight that stayed in the room long after he stopped speaking. In that moment, many things I had experienced in my childhood started to make sense in a different way. The seriousness around swimming lessons, the insistence on completing every level, the lack of flexibility, the quiet intensity in his expression whenever water was involved. It all connected back to something he had lived through as a child, something that shaped him in a permanent way. It wasn't just about teaching me a skill. It was about making sure I would never be in a situation where helplessness would define me in the same way it defined him. When I think back on those swimming lessons now, I see them differently. They weren't just structured classes in a pool. They were part of something deeper, something emotional that I didn't have the language to understand at the time. There was a kind of silent protection behind it, a belief that if I learned to swim properly, I would never face the kind of helplessness he once faced. That I would never stand by and be unable to act when it mattered most. That I would never carry that same kind of memory. Over time, I completed all 8 levels. It didn't happen quickly, and it didn't feel easy. But eventually I reached the point where swimming became natural. I didn't have to think about it in the same way anymore. It became something my body understood without hesitation. My dad never made a big moment out of it. There was no celebration when I finished the final level. No emotional speech or visible relief. He simply acknowledged it in his usual way, with a nod and a few words of approval. But I could sense something beneath that calm reaction. Something like quiet relief, even if he didn't express it openly. Looking back now, I understand that his way of handling things was shaped by what he had lost. He didn't talk about it often, but it influenced how he saw responsibility, safety, and preparation for life. He turned that experience into action, into structure, into something that could protect instead of just hurt. As I grew older, I started to appreciate that more deeply. Not just the lessons themselves, but the reason behind them. It wasn't about control or strictness. It was about trying to make sure that history didn't repeat itself in the same painful way. Even now, whenever I'm near water, I think about it differently. Not with fear, but with awareness. I understand that it demands respect, attention, and care. I understand that skill matters, and that preparation can make the difference between helplessness and control. But beyond that, I also understand something else. I understand that some lessons are not just taught in classrooms or pools. Some lessons are passed down quietly through experience, even when they are never fully spoken aloud. They shape the way people raise their children, the choices they make, and the rules they insist on, without always explaining why. For my dad, learning to swim wasn't just an activity. It was something tied to memory, loss, and the hope that I would never have to experience what he once did. And for me, it became something I carried forward without even realizing it first.